Tēnā koutou katoa, this is Gone by Lunchtime. It's the 26th of March, 2026. There's a lot going on, but top of the list is it's Annabelle Lee Mather's birthday.
It
Happy
is.
birthday, Annabelle.
Thank you so much. My favourite sound effect. Thank you. That
His
just
grin
gave me all the vibes.
is filling the room. It's got almost as much power as a Winston Peters. Big one. Also the birthday, I hear just informed us, of Bernard Hickey. Happy birthday, Bernard.
Huri huri tau.
Also the birthday of our very own Gin Follett.
Huri huri tau, Gin, you gorgeous thing.
Birthday, Gin.
Aries, kings and queens, us all.
And Maturata, apparently.
Maturata, the late great Maturata. Yes, it's his birthday too.
Wow, that's a really good, it's almost like we need to find someone who's a bit of a downer, because those are all top names.
Would you like me to Google and see if I can? I feel like it might be Tina Turner's birthday.
Oh, that's another one. That's another
Can I
great
just check?
Wow.
Tina Turner, star of Mad Max Beyond the Thunderdome.
No, I think you mean
Which-
Oh, no,
Turner's
sorry,
car.
I lie. She's 26th of November. That's my daughter's
Tina for-
birthday.
Yeah. All right, let's crack on. Enough of that sentimental nonsense.
Cut it out.
We will, in the course of this podcast, get to the recent allegations made by Chris Pipkin's ex-wife and the rights and wrongs of all that, have a word on Brooke Van Velden, talk about Winston Peters and his State of the Nation speech. But first, fuel, all the economic repercussions around the world and in New Zealand of the US-Israel war in Iran, which is now getting up to nearly 4 weeks in. I should say at the outset, by way of disclosure, many of you will recall how during the COVID-19 coronavirus crisis, it became clear over time that the three of us were some of the country's leading epidemiologists. I should say at the outset that we don't like to bring these things up, energy security experts.
Mm-hmm.
We are bona fide Hormuzologists. We've been talking about the Strait of Hormuz for years and years.
You might also remember that I watched Chernobyl and I became New Zealand's leading nuclear energy scientist as well, which is quite helpful during this period as well.
And we only say that stuff because we feel we need to say it, because you might think we're just sort of jobbing political pundits who encounter something and then try to give the impression. But in fact, Ben Thomas has been deep in Persian Gulf energy security issues for decades, haven't you, Ben?
Wait, sorry, I just need to text somebody. My apologies.
I thought he was going to declare a conflict of interest.
Right. In New Zealand, petrol's up 35% since the war started. Diesel up 80%, not sure on the latest on jet fuel. Filters through to every part of the economy, so it's not just petrol, though it might be nice to inoculate that from a political standpoint. It's everything. It's the fuel in the trucks that deliver the food to the supermarkets. It's the fertilizer as well as the fuel that grows the stuff, which affects other parts of the world more than New Zealand.
Plastics that make the pipes that the plumbers put in.
It's every single corner of the economy that is affected. The government response wrote yesterday, did a survey of the different responses in different countries around the world, particularly Asia, but around the world. And New Zealand's actually been reasonably swift in its response in terms of the announcement, certainly that was made by Nicola, Willis and Luxon on Tuesday. The relief package, was it timely, temporary and targeted?
Targeted.
Which amounted to $50 a week for about 135,000 people who receive the in-work tax credit as part of the Working for Families scheme. And it was an interesting, among other things, there are criticisms that doesn't include beneficiaries. It doesn't include people who don't have children. So it is there are people who miss out, and that's sort of been acknowledged by the government in some ways. They wanted to do it as sort of quickly and efficiently as they could. $50 a week is not nothing. That will make a difference in those people who are lucky enough to get it. The whole kind of presentation of it, Annabelle, was interesting to me because it, in many ways, it has the appearance of a COVID response in terms of leaning into the crisis. We talked about this last time, how they might do that, and they certainly have. of we've got a fuel plan with 4 levels in it. As one of my colleagues said, it's the alert levelification of New Zealand continues.
Mm-hmm.
That's all very familiar. We've got, we're now looking at the, percentage number of days of fuel on ships and the way that we used to look at cases in the community. And yet, Nicola, Willis and Christopher Luxon both stressed maybe a dozen times over the course of that announcement on Tuesday that this is not COVID, because the COVID response was flabby and damaging. So they've got to say they want to have the kind of appearance of a COVID level emergency response, but be very clear that they're not doing it in a COVID-y way. What have you made of that first burst of response?
I was happy for the quote squeezed middle to see that they are going to get $50 a week, and honestly deeply troubled that underneath the squeezed middle, some of the poorest, most vulnerable New Zealanders in the country, people who have lost their jobs. If you think of what's happened with McCain's this week, a whole lot of people about to lose their jobs, those kinds of people that have lost their jobs in this terrible economic climate will not be eligible. The children of beneficiaries, sickness beneficiaries, our elderly have been literally left out in the cold, and I think that's a really troubling response for literally how are we going to take care of these people through this crisis. So that first and foremost. I found it interesting that it seems that Luxon still hasn't registered that for his own self-preservation he should be trying to distance himself from Donald Trump. And I thought it was strange to see New Zealand sign that letter, which I think, was criticising Iran for closing the Strait of Hormuz. I just thought it was, why would you do that? It was unnecessary, has no benefit to New Zealand. If you won't speak out about other international issues, such as what is, largely agreed was the illegal invasion of Iran or attack on Iran, why would you then sign up to that letter when Trump is deeply unpopular for the most part here, because New Zealanders are feeling the burn of petrol prices, inflation, all of those things. So I thought it was in that regard, I thought that the comms around that was an interesting decision by National.
That letter, which came out on Sunday, I think, was a curious one insofar as it denounced Iran for blocking the Hormuz Strait and said, you must stop this, but didn't mention at all whether there might have been anything that led to that happening.
Exactly.
It operated in a vacuum.
Exactly.
But it also said...
Now is not the time to focus on the past.
That's right. That's right. It was also like, Tehran, stop this. It's kind of, we've signed a letter saying stop this. And I know that lots of things are like that in the worlds of diplomacy and all that. But there was also, I was reading it, and it said, you can imagine Iran getting the letter and they see it and it says, we've been told to stop blockading the Strait of Hormuz. And the Ayatollah goes, well, that doesn't mean anything. They go, well, hang on a minute, sir. It says here, in the strongest terms, in the opening line. At which point they're like, well, hang on a minute. Well, hang on a minute. Not the strongest terms, sir.
I mean, look, we all know who the real enemy is here, which is that yesterday I think Donald Trump said that the war is over and has been over for some time, and the only ones keeping it going are the New York Times and its shoddy reporting. So I guess that Iran, responding to articles in the New York Times alleging that the war continues, has blocked off the strait, leading to these problems. They are in a tough position because, look, I'm sure there will come a point at which the capriciousness of the United States administration means that there's actually no point in pandering to them anymore, that the gains sort of towing the line or trying not to upset the Trump administration are so low that, we will probably break with that. Right now, they do remain at least in theory, a sort of strategic partner, although you would really have to reassess just how much any kind of strategic guarantee or suggestion of that from the States is worth right now. I would say very little. And they still are our second largest trading partner, so or second largest export destination, and so was it second or third. But anyway, they're significant. There are potential downstream consequences of alienating the regime, and it does lead to this ridiculous situation where we all know why this is happening. It's because Trump is essentially insane, and and the government has to, or the government feels that it has to work within this fiction that, inscrutable events in the Middle East, probably Iran's fault, have led to this escalating cost of living crisis and potential, energy security crisis as well. And that's difficult because I think Annabelle's right. I think it would play electorally, especially with centre voters, much better if Luxon came out and sort of condemned Trump. We saw Willis actually inching much closer towards that in interviews. I think was it Monday, saying this is this is not our fault. This is because of a war that we do not support.
Yeah.
Now,
did she say that?
It did a couple of weeks ago, though.
Right.
Yeah, and I think when she was challenged on the sort of exact semantics, she sort of wheeled it back. Sort of, well, it's not really. We didn't really have anything to do with the war starting. We didn't really have a say in it.
It's not that we unsupport it. It's just that we haven't expressly supported it. If you recall, we acknowledged it.
But Willis, who I think that her political antenna has been twitching like crazy during this episode. I would agree with most of the commentariat that I think she has presented very well in the early stages. She has looked pretty prime ministerial. She's, really sort of, assumed that, I know, Toby, you say they're trying to keep away from that kind of COVID imagery, but I think it's very apparent that they see this as their, potentially sort of government making crisis leadership moment.
Oh, 100%. No, I mean, to be clear,
Willis is really leading in.
I think exactly. I mean, I put it as there are bits of COVID cosplay in there. Like, it's very much let's present it in the manner that shows that we are aware there is a crisis, and at a moment of crisis, you need a leader. And Nicola Willis has presented herself pretty well in that, Annabelle. I mean, she is adept in those situations. She is a kind of, as Luxon reminds us, he's not a career politician, and he struggles sometimes in those settings to have that gravitas.
I think too the problem with Luxon is that he is not a clear communicator, and that's really what you need in a crisis, and that's why Jacinda did so well during COVID, initially, is that, clear, simple messaging, and that's not something that Luxon is strong on. I've watched with interest the way Labour have really fumbled this moment. To me, it seems like this is a time where they could be really kind of owning the show and putting up some interesting ideas. And like, for example, I've been looking at the Labour social media pages, and I'm like, if I was them, I would have been saying stuff like, do you remember that, the incentive we had for e-vehicles? If that had stayed in place, this amount of people would have had them by now. That's X amount of people who aren't competing with you for petrol at the pump, all of those sort of initiatives. This would be a great time to pump all of those up again and remind people where we could have been.
You would think they might have chosen something like the half-price public transport and just hammered something like that.
Yeah.
Clearly what's gone on, or it seems to me.
But it's all like, well, we don't have the books. We can't say, well, that's not very comforting. When Hannah Rafferty, Maipi Clark, is putting out more ideas on social media about how she thinks the government could respond to this situation than Labor is. Like the Greens, I thought the Greens plan was excellent. You know, it played into all of their policies really well, and it brought up current things that people really care about, like, you know, for rural people, the changing of the school bus routes and all of that stuff, like really smart. And Labor is just not stepping onto the field. I've heard people say, oh, you know, because you can hit things the wrong way and get the tone wrong and it, you know, it backfires on you. But in a moment like this, I think it's incumbent on the opposition party to put up like a, you know, just put a 5-point plan up or a 10-point plan, like bring something.
Yeah, interesting. I'm keen to hear what you think of this, Ben. But I think you're right, Annabelle. The other thing that the Greens did well, I thought, was in terms of the way they presented it as an offer. So they said, we can give you enough votes to get through these things, which gives it an air of a constructive approach.
Yes.
Because I think that there are a bunch of things going on for Labor. One is their pre-existing Ming Vase strategy get the Ming Vase and the Starmer's Labor in the UK from one side of the room to the other without breaking it. That version of the small target strategy, you know, guys, do as little as possible, let them mess it up. So that pre-exists. Layer on top of that, we don't want to talk about our COVID response and to be told, but it didn't work in COVID because that suits National. And then on top of that again, the sort of ghosts of the Simon Bridges moment when we're talking about COVID, where he went quite antagonistically oppositional in the early part. You look back at most of the things he said, many of them certainly, they don't look remotely scandalous now. It was more a tonal thing. He came in quite hard. People said, not now, Simon. At the moment, we're all scared. We all want to be gathered together. It almost kind of vibed unpatriotic. So I'm guessing that all of those things together have left Labor in this really awkward position where they did, like you say, they're like, oh, it's not us, we're not the government, you know, which is quite, like, obviously true. But also you can have ideas without being the government. And then they came up with the GST thing, which I saw you remarking, Ben, on social media, that, of course, it doesn't really, the maths don't really work. The idea that all the extra GST that's collected on the increased cost of petrol that there's going to be a drop GST through lack of sales of petrol and other purchases across the economy.
But
right?
even that, like they could have argued the toss on that. They could have said, well, no one's been told to like cut their petrol use. Like actually no one's using less petrol at the moment. People might be like trying, but there's no like concerted national effort to do it. So yes, absolutely they will be making more GST for now. But you know, they just went quiet on it and it's like, okay. Interesting,
I think they
interesting
probably realised
approach.
it was wrong. I think they probably checked with Barb Edmonds, who was like, "No, that's not going to fly."
No, guys.
And I think that's been a problem. I think with Labor throughout this term in opposition, they have prospered, particularly given their disastrous election result last time. They're now back re-established as the biggest party in terms of support, consistently in polling in the mid to high 30s. It's a great result for Chris Hipkins, and it's all been predicated on that Ming Vase small target strategy, which this week was revealed as literally the smallest target strategy, where we don't have any ideas. We are smooth brains, no thoughts, you can't read our mind to get our policies out of us because there are none. They're like, we present as just totally like, I really wish that Hipkins had actually, he buckled and then he started suggesting under pressure some pretty bad suggestions for policies. But I would have preferred that he doubled down, went into the election debates, and when asked, what he would do, say, don't ask me, I'm not the Prime Minister. And then, what if you win? And he's like, I don't deal in hypotheticals.
He's taken to the nth degree the maxim that oppositions don't win elections, but governments lose them. It's like, well, in case we're not required, we'll just be available when we're called on to negotiate the next government. Until then, could someone call us when that's all done?
Yeah, but like you say, I think the Greens have like played their cards really smartly through this.
And I think Labor, I think you're right that Labor are worried about the hangover of COVID, the residual bad feeling that a lot of particularly Aucklanders have. But at the same time, I think they've misjudged it. This is not a COVID kind of situation.
Exactly.
Jacinda Ardern got that rally around the flag thing going, got, all that kickback against Simon Bridges. That came in the context of we were being bombarded with international news about all of Italy is shut down. New York had roller doors, ready to deal with all the dead bodies they were expecting. And we
Refrigerated
got down to
trucks.
yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah.
then, New York is silent except for the sirens. And then we had Jacinda Ardern in full prime ministerial pomp standing up in front of the nation going, we're 0 cases. We got rid of it. We're free. We're opening up again. There is no situation where that happens in an oil price shock. The
Yeah.
best that you can announce is, thanks to the conflict in the Middle East, ending, prices will return to normal in due course. That's all you can do. There's no declaring, like victory or anything. So you're not going to get it. Like, I think Nicola Willis has done really well. I actually think Luxon has done pretty well. I think that, interestingly enough, because of his background, I think supply chains and fuel security are two of the subjects that he actually speaks very knowledgeably, but also lucidly and directly on, in a sort of normal way that's both intelligible and sort of has an air of authority about it. So I think this is, he's fighting on home ground here. I think they've presented well. They've done as well as I think they could in terms of that sort of presentational leadership aspect. But the underlying fact is that fuel costs $2.60 or whatever if you get 91 like I do, a month or two ago, and now it's $3.40. And, whether people think that that's your fault or not, people will be grumpy, people will be feeling worse about their lives, and that's terrible for a government. So the only way I think that, that they can really prosper out of this is if Labour, which has supplanted them as the most popular single party, looks like they have no ideas, that they're totally flailing, that, they don't have any ideas on how to support people who feel like they're missing out. No, that's not to say that there should be these big policies splashing around money for support. That would be a disaster. The problem is not enough fuel and, the same amount of money chasing it worldwide. By putting more money into the economy but not having any more goods to pursue, that just drives up inflation. So we can't, by definition, we can't help everyone, because if we give money to everyone, then everyone's prices go up. So it's across the economy. So, the government's very aware of that. They've taken this very small targeted approach, but with a pretty hefty sum, $50 after tax. That's nothing to sneeze at. Now, I sometimes think, to paraphrase Orwell, if you wanted to imagine the future of New Zealand politics, if you want to see the future of New Zealand politics, imagine two parties offering voters $50 a week forever. That's pretty much what our major party politics boils down to, is every 3 years being offered $20 to $50 a week by either of the two major parties. So, this is something that's very familiar. But it does opens up a lot of opportunities for attack. A caregiver on the radio this morning talking about the distances that she had to cover to care for elderly patients. Those are the same demographics who were screwed over by the pay equity stuff, right? And so there are a lot of opportunities for, Labour to really take the attack to the government here. They're not taking them, and it seems to be out of a sort of either a sense of undue caution or the fact that after 2.5 years of not saying or doing anything, they've actually sort of atrophied as a political unit. And you saw that in the sort of slightly botched nature of their, quote unquote, big announcements last year about policy. I don't know that they're very good at announcing policy, at running issues in the media anymore, because I don't think they've done it for 2.5 years.
I just wonder why they haven't done stuff like, we've called the heads of every petrol company in New Zealand, and we've told them that, we're expecting them to, put the best interests of New Zealand to the fore, and we're also asking why petrol prices went up so quick, given that they'd already been purchased for the lower rate. We've called all the the grocery companies, and we've told them to, they've had huge profits this year. They might have to sharpen their pencils to get help New Zealanders through this period. We're encourage all government organisations to, come up with work from home plans for as many staff as possible. Not yet, but in the future, when the rubber really starts to hit the road, just basic stuff like that wouldn't actually require a huge amount of costing or whatever, but things too that resonates with the public. The public are already annoyed with petrol companies and supermarkets. I thought the Greens plan, the windfall tax that they proposed was a really smart one. I just don't understand why. I mean, you don't need to be in the books per se to be able to come up with some ideas like that at least.
Yeah, it's what you're saying is do a thing. You remember even back in the days when Grant Robertson launched the Future of Work program, and it was look, we are organising, bringing people together, designing policy. Here's a bit of the way that we're designing the policy so we can bring people in and consult and all that sort of thing. There are other things. I mean, for example, in Greece, the government is doing some fuel subsidies, which I don't think anyone is arguing for here, but they're doing it and saying we're funding it by applying a tax to online casinos, which almost nobody would argue with, So there are other ways of proposing things that you could say would be fiscally neutral in some fashion and therefore avoid the backlash of you're just doing, spraying money again. Speaking of people doing big things, Winston Peters, Tauranga, Sunday, State of the Nation speech, 1,000 punters there, the overflow room's full, bit of action outside, and maybe we'll come to that in a minute with relation to the fish catch U-turn. But Winston Peters is sitting on 10-11%, Annabelle, and we've talked about this before, but if you go back to the same position in the electoral cycle after when New Zealand First is in government in some form or other, more or less they're at less than half of what they achieved in those elections. This time, they got 6.1 in the election. They're sitting on 10, 11 now. They've absolutely somehow mastered being the opposition while in government. Winston Peters has mastered being, in many cases, a statesman on the world stage, a deputy prime minister until the halfway point, while being in sometimes, and we've just talked about the Labour Party playing small target, the most effective opposition MP in Parliament. How are they doing that? How much of that do you think is, another thing that happened on the weekend, of course, is that in Australia, Pauline Hans's One Nation Party came second in the South Australia state election. So there is something going on globally. Nigel Farage in
Popularism
the
is
UK.
popular.
Populism, nationalist populism is a thing.
Is
it's
popular.
Clearly on the it's
Top
nationally
of the pops.
popular. What's going on?
I think that it's kind of a bit of a perfect storm for him. I think there's, we see what's going on internationally, and New Zealand First is a reflection of that movement. But I also think that probably Luxon is helping Peters in that regard, because I think that there's probably some kind of national types that don't enjoy Luxon's style of communication and probably don't see him as being a strong enough leader, and they are going over to New Zealand First. So I think that's probably definitely a part of it. I think it was really interesting to see Alfred Ngaro.
Who are you?
Was it? I was going to
Who are
say
you?
announced as a candidate, but I don't think he was technically announced, was he?
I think
he
he
just
announced-
appeared on stage.
I think he announced he would be standing, perhaps in the course of it, or intimated that.
I mean-
but yes, he was meant to be introduced by somebody else, and then at the end, it was kind of brutal. Much better to hear from the crowd bullshit or nonsense or get off. Much better to hear that than Who are you?
Who are you? Was Stuart Nash at this conference? Is Stuart Nash still part of New Zealand
I think he's
First?
still on detention. Yeah.
I think he's going to outlive all of us, obviously. But I do wonder if, like, he needs to be a little bit careful about not appearing like a used car salesman with these, like, retread MPs that have, like, crapped out of other parties, and he's trying to, like, hock off
Right.
these like bombs off to
Yeah.
New Zealanders. I do wonder
There's
what
nothing wrong with the chassis, sir. It's fine. It just
It's the mileage. Nothing wrong with the odometer. It's fine. But I do question, like, what does Alfred Ngaro bring to New Zealand First? It just seems a very odd kind of union because, you know, he's like super Christian, super conservative. And although there is conservatism in New Zealand First, obviously, but I don't know if it's really Christian conservatism.
I mean, I do wonder whether when it was designed at whatever point at the start of the year, Stuart Nash was to be the opening act. Who knows? But I tell you what he does bring. New Zealand, a party I don't think we've discussed nearly enough on this podcast, from which Alfred Ngaro has hopped over to New Zealand First. They did get 0.4% in the last election.
Amazing.
0.4% is not heaps, but it's not nothing, right? Like the Conservative
It's
Party got
0.4%.
0.2%. And so that's, you know, like you look at how he's kind of found these pockets of
True.
votes, like the stuff
True.
on vaccines,
Yeah.
the stuff on trans stuff. It's like, he's like, okay, now that we've got those, we'll just draw a line around them.
Yeah.
And there was,
Very
I
true.
thought,
Very
interestingly, he has, I mean, it was definitely, he plays the hits. You know, you don't go and see Winston Peters and not expect to hear the hits, right? So he rolled out the hits against everything in the speech.
He did. He even said virtue signaling again. I was like, oh my God, like throwback classic.
Totally.
Like,
It's like, get out your
'Cause
lighter
only-
and hold it aloft in the
are
air.
we at the point now where it's too woke to call people woke and that we have to go back to
Go
virtual
back to,
signal?
political correctness,
Yeah.
virtue signaling, all of that.
All the goodies.
Play the hits, and he did.
Cultural Marxism.
But all of that, the what he seemed to emphasise, or the emphasis that seemed to emerge from it, was the social conservatism piece, which is obviously Alfred Ngaro, and I think
Yeah.
that there is an available bit of turf that they're looking for, and also the energy stuff, which is not a new policy. The breaking up the gentailers is not a new policy, and it doesn't appear to have an awful lot of detail wrapped around it at this point.
It's one that they immediately forget about as soon as they get back into government.
Maybe, but it is a moment where I think people are more receptive to a line that says you're paying too much for your power. There's an energy crisis rippling around the world. We're going to break up these people who are taking the mickey, is the sort of line. What did you see there, Ben?
Yeah, I thought the emphasis on social conservatism was very interesting because that is a pretty clear space. There aren't any other political parties that are socially conservative. ACT has those strains in it. But
The three strike
Well,
stuff, but not the kind of Christian conservatism stuff.
Although with their position on Israel, you could argue they do.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and look, they'll try and match, New Zealand First on trans bathrooms and things like that. But David Seymour certainly presents as, an urban liberal. Brooke Van Velden, certainly urban liberal, who we'll get to later. Whereas New Zealand First is very sort of squarely in that, old school New Zealand, none of this woke nonsense. But Annabelle's right. I've never really seen sort of Christian conservatism, particularly, and you'll have to forgive me because I'm not big on, sort of the different gradations, but Alfred, I think it was quite sort of evangelical, as I recall, his sort of strain with New Zealand. When he launched the party, he was sort of, talking about God's kingdom on earth, and I think the rapture sort of came into it, but it was very sort of kind of inflected like those American religious right sort of organizations before they, I guess, moderated their entire belief systems to accord with Donald Trump's policy programs. Which, I mean, this is always very interesting to me because I really like Alfred Ngaro. I think he's a great guy. And but in my dealings with him, the faith, the expressions of his faith through politics never really came up. And it certainly, there is a constituency there. I think that per Stuart Nash, still on the reserves bench, if that, maybe the water boy, Nash certainly paid the price for sticking his head above the parapet, to use Winston Peters' language.
Paid the price
earlier
for
on.
talking about anatomy in an open fashion.
But he stood back up again.
He got back up again.
Paid the price,
dust and the
paid the
blood.
price for believing in science.
Mm.
Paid the price for telling the truth about dimorphic gender. And
In a way that was accessible to youngsters,
Yeah.
and the audience of the platform.
And Harate Hapango, another former National Party MP, who also got into trouble with Luxon when he took over as leader for her sort of outspoken, I would say slightly wacko religious beliefs. And so presumably Alfred has been sort of, been given a bit of a, caution about sort of going too far out there when he's not speaking to his own communities, I guess, of interest. But look, the other thing I think they're looking for, and I think it might have been Adam Pearce wrote about this for the Herald, New Zealand First are a bit of a boom-bust party. They over the years, they have gone from huge numbers of MPs to twice in the past 0 MPs, and then they have to come back, and they have almost been the sort of test case of, who are these people on the party list and what sort of scandal can we expect from them in the first year or so. They've been very free of that this term, I think. I think possibly the most backbencher scandal-free party in Parliament, maybe. But they, there is that concern. They're going to get a lot of new MPs. They've got 8 currently. They're probably on track for at least 16. There is a huge amount of upside for them in the campaign. They're the real sort of centre of political gravity right now. All the momentum's with them. So they could be looking at 8 new MPs. Now, that's a lot of scope for problems because they don't have as you can see from their big conferences, and they're very proud of this. They are building up more of a sort of party infrastructure, as opposed to just being a sort of triennial sort of thing that pops into existence to sign off coalition agreements or whatever.
As opposed to just being
party.
Winston Peters' boot and other things that he might pull out of it over the course of the day.
That's right. The RSA sort of fucking smokers section that you just kind of, but. So Ngaro, look, he had a mini scandal when he was a minister, but he has been a minister before. He is actually a very competent MP. My old boss, Chris Finlayson, was running him down on another New Zealand political podcast recently, but Ngaro is, he's competent, he's experienced. So, you hear rumours Ron Mark, would be somebody that they would probably be trying to bring back. Winston might have 6 or 7 other brothers that he could bring in, and how they actually recruit for that extended lineup. I think there were moves towards that with Nash, and I think he sort of failed the audition a bit. But you could see it sort of happening. The other thing is all these guys are mates, right? Like Nash and Ngaro and Penny Henare, these are all like gym buddies at Parliament, right? So there's certainly there is this New Zealand First demographic that exists kind of in the New Zealand Parliament of sort of blokey blokes, sort of centristy, sort of conservative
gym guys. The gym guys.
They'll only get in if Shane Jones stops proposing wildly unpopular legislation like the no size limits on fish. Like, man, what a stinker that was.
What happened there? Because he
What
was
on earth
confronting
was that?
protesters outside the speech venue on Sunday, and he was doing the Matua Shane stuff and sort of being kind of eloquently deriding these people for their stances. And then something happened in the last 48 hours, and then yesterday afternoon everyone was clamouring for saying we were responsible for the collapse of this reform. That is the opening up smaller fish catchment sizes to commercial fishers, which recreational fishers had pushed back against hard. Winston said, we listened. And he got the tweet out first. Then ACT put out a press release saying, we got this change through. And then Luxon's going, I had a word with Shane. And it's a bit messy.
I mean, I know that New Zealand First has always had a very close relationship with the commercial fishing sector, but this one really did surprise me because I think a lot of kind of, those blokey blokes that they were talking about before, a lot of them are recreational fishers.
Yeah.
They are right in their demographic. And it just, amazed me that Shane, who he calls himself a retail politician, like he's got a good ear for what's popular and what isn't, would propose a legislation that would be so deeply unpopular with a demographic that he wants to be alongside with.
I mean, he's had the depth of those links with the industry, though, go all the way back to Sealord deal, don't they? I mean, he is quite involved with that lot. Whereas, you wonder whether Winston's finger in the air is also like whether it might even have been when I saw that tweet at first from Winston Peters, I thought maybe he had actually heard from people on the ground in Tauranga going, this isn't on. But since then, it seems as though. Maybe
I shouldn't be surprised because there was a time when Shane was pro-commercial whaling.
That's right. That's right. What's your read on all of that, Ben Thomas, our man in Wellington?
Yeah, look at it. In terms of New Zealand First, I think they're just getting out ahead of the reversal by going, oh, look, we've decided.
So who pulled the carpet?
The same way. I would say ACT and National.
And so maybe Winston wouldn't have let that happen without extracting some kind of concession. So he got both the concession and
I don't think that's right.
The gazumping.
No, because I don't think there are concessions at this stage, right? What we're seeing now in terms of the three parties in the coalition is what I actually expected this government to look like, on election night, say, and what it avoided looking like by having these extremely compendious coalition agreements with all of these very, very specifically stipulated commitments and in huge volume for both New Zealand First and ACT, and signing those two up to a number of national platforms, right? When you don't have that, when you don't have this sort of Bible for all of these commitments, you basically have a situation where everything is predicated on three legs of the stool supporting it, and if one yanks it out, it doesn't go ahead. So we've seen that with the fishing, seen it with the the paywave surcharge as well.
That's an interesting thing happening right now, whereby David Seymour has said it's dead. He literally has used the word the bill is dead. National is saying, no, it's not. So it's again, and it's, coming at the same time as this fishing thing. It's starting to, are you telling me it's going to be like this all the way up to the campaign?
Yeah, absolutely. Because as you say, for the three parties to agree on something, if it's something that they're against, if they're otherwise against it, they will want a concession somewhere else. Now, but then you need the other party to agree to that, and you get a very complicated situation where essentially there is a real bias against new activity or action in any area where it wasn't agreed as part of the coalition agreement. And those agreements have basically been discharged. Pretty much everything on those agreements is either done or sort of about to be finished off, or has been sort of discarded as no longer relevant.
So you're saying like the period of lane swimming in the pool is finished and now it's just free for all and anyone can do what they like?
Well, now it's just three people swimming in different directions, unable to move, right?
In the same lane at each other.
Yeah, and so I think with things like, say, the $50 payment, the working for whatever, the relief for the petrol, you would get a sort of agreement there. I think Thomas Coughlan reported that the deadline where it finishes if 91 falls under $3 for 4 consecutive weeks, that was inserted by Act. That National originally proposed it as here's just a year-long benefit increase. So I think on those things where they realise that the public expects some kind of announcement, they expect some kind of action, you will get this sort of, agreement compromise. But where it's something that's really not pressing, that there's not a sort of clamour amongst the public, or that it will simply be better for each party with its own supporters, like, say, the credit card surcharge stuff or the fishing, they'll just pull support. And it will be very, very hard to get anything more than sort of minor changes or minor activity through before the election. And the interesting thing about it is both of those things cleared Cabinet. They were both Cabinet decisions that have been signed off at each stage, Cabinet Committee, Cabinet. Legislation was I think, introduced into the House, and then in both cases, one or more of the parties just said, no, not going ahead with it anymore.
Will it be a little bit like, after the election when there's no government and everything is, the vibes are chill?
Everything's beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. Will it be like that vibe? Except for obviously like the whole energy crisis and like the world being at war and all of that. But besides from that, will that be the vibe?
I think that's right. For us, it will be. But the government will be like a swan standing still while kicking each other under the water. And yeah.
He runga te kōrero kei raro te rahurahu.
Hey, Annabelle,
Yes.
you're a producer, it says here, a seasoned media veteran, even, one might say.
Exciting.
In recent weeks, it was maybe a week and a half ago that seemingly out of the blue, Chris Hipkins' ex-wife posted on Facebook in a private group some allegations, none of which involved anything illegal, that amounted to effectively, I don't believe you treated me and your family correctly when we were together, and essentially charges of hypocrisy in relation to the policy being outlined and the headers under which they appeared by Labour. Then we had that strange period of time in which these things emerged through social media. She took the post down, but stood by the statements made in remarks to media. And then after about maybe 48 hours, Chris Hipkins, who'd been in Australia when he got back, spoke on the tiles to the point. He refused to get involved in the particulars of it, but denied it very clearly, and then choked up when talking about the impact it might have on his children. At that point, it was clearly something that was going to be reported. Before then, there had been some interesting attempts of reporting or not reporting. What do you make of all that? It's a different world we're in now when information seeps out through non-traditional challenges. It's not like the media. I'm suggesting that the media used to be pure. I mean, we've had all sorts of stuff in The Truth and elsewhere in the days gone by. MPs outed for their sexuality affairs revealed. But there has been, broadly speaking, the media don't get involved in the bedrooms. There are hypocrisies, a different thing. What did you make of all that in terms of the way it was reported? Is this a story?
With my producer hat on, my feeling is that unless the allegations were of a legal nature, or for example something like domestic violence, I feel that if you can't say what those allegations are, it's not because they're subject to like court orders, suppression orders, anything like that, and you can't prove one way or another as a member of as a journalist, as a member of the media, whether or not they're true, then I don't think that you really have any business publishing them or publishing that as a story. And I was, when the headline first came up, I was like, holy crap. What are these? What are these allegations? They could have been anything. And of course, your mind goes to terrible places when you see something like that in the paper. And then when they were later leaked out into the public, I don't think that they were of a nature that's in the public interest. And so, yeah, I personally, they're not something that I, as a producer, would run on one of my programs.
Ben?
Look, I'm on record as not approving of the modern world. In the olden days when I was a journalist, 180 years ago or whatever, back in the late 2000s, this wouldn't have been a story, I don't think. I think it was only I think if it had been on her Facebook page and hadn't been reproduced sort of more widely on social media, I don't think it would have been a story either. I think once it was widely shared via screenshots, etc., I think that Henry Cook did a piece for the Post. I don't know what his methodology was, but he estimated sort of maybe 100,000 people had seen it. I think the whole thing was sort of strangely kind of characterized. People were talking about, oh, well, if there's no more evidence, there's no story there. And it's like, well, if you look at the nature of the allegations, what's the kind of evidence they would be looking for? I mean, it's, essentially the allegations were that she felt poorly treated by Hipkins in and after their relationship. Quite probably true. He says he wasn't, it was all news to him and he denied it. It's probably true that it was news to him. Those things happen in relationships, particularly with politicians. They're very self-absorbed. They get very caught up in the job. It's quite possible that you can be part of a terrible relationship and not even be aware of it if you're a politician. It's the sort of thing that I think it sort of had to be broadly reported on, but I think that's probably the end of it. People can make their own decisions about whatever they think it reveals about character. I wouldn't have thought that it became a leadership issue for the reasons that Annabelle said. Doesn't bear on sort of professional or legal responsibilities. On the other hand, I think, though, as a wider point, I think that the stories like this are actually a good test case for the mainstream media, because I think it was reported in a pretty responsible way. I think the commentary online was appalling and reduced to absolutely awful partisanship on both sides. And I think that most people sort of lost their humanity when thinking about what was clearly an issue between two people about a failed relationship, that I think just gets incorporated by people into their sort of, socially acquired schizophrenic sort of, view of the timeline as some big NZ pole Game of Thrones drama or something for their own amusement.
I personally don't think the media did a good job, and I don't think they were responsible in the way they reported it. I think I question whether or not it was necessary for him to do a stand-up, because I kind of felt like that gave them license at that point to run it. But I do think that actually, as a result of that stand-up, that this situation might actually be of benefit to him, because I think most people, or many New Zealanders, can relate to what it's like to have a difficult breakup. It showed his love of his children, and it humanised him. And I think that there'll be a lot of New Zealanders, and particularly men, who really empathised with him in that moment. So I don't think it will necessarily be bad for him. But I also think the other part of this is, when you're reporting on stuff that relates to children, there's another level of responsibility that comes with that too.
That's a good point. Yeah.
I just don't think it was our greatest moment in the New Zealand media. And just because it's out there on social media, when the Tim Jago stuff was going on, lots of people were talking about it on social media. Now, I know that was a subject of suppression orders and stuff, but we actually can exercise our will and say, even though it's out there, we're not going to run it because this is personal stuff and it involves kids, and we didn't do that. And I think it's a shame, and we all have those days in the newsroom, but I hope that people's feelings, that people have kind of maybe reassessed it and reflected on it. And I felt like when he did start to choke up in that press conference, even some of the wording around that, like Hipkins cries during press conference, it's like, I wouldn't say that. He choked up, but it felt like it was sort of being dramatised a bit. And yeah, I think there's some stuff for us to reflect on in the media about whether or not we tackle these sorts of stories in the future.
And a point that's been made elsewhere was another one, which is that what does it mean for people who are thinking about a life in public service potentially and getting elected to Parliament? It's these sorts of moments don't necessarily encourage leaping into that fray. And we do want people to leap into that fray. One who's leaping out of the fray is a senior member of the ACT Party, which we'll just touch on briefly before we say goodbye. It was just before the announcement of the relief package on Tuesday, and it was one of those things that happens when you hear ACT's giving an unscheduled press conference in I think it was in the legislative chamber, and it was with 15 minutes notice, and it's about an and you're like, this is we've all sort of, there's a kind of muscle memory that kicks in when this is a personnel thing probably. You don't announce a policy with 15 minutes notice. It just doesn't happen like that. And then there was some speculation, maybe David Seymour is standing down. Maybe he's not going to go. Not the case. And he looked a bit perplexed at that idea. But in fact, Brooke Van Velden, his deputy, who's been a success story for ACT in recent years, won Tamaki at the last election, and has, before politics, was successfully kind of campaigned, lobbied, organised the end-of-life choice bill for David Seymour, and has decided she is going to leave politics the next election to spend more time with the private sector. She wants to. I don't know about you, Annabelle, but the immediate thought that went through my mind was she used to work with Ben at Exceltium for a period of time. And it can't be easy when you're going through a political career in Parliament. You're not universally popular. You're doing the pay equity thing. You're doing workplace relations, a lot of rewarding stuff, but lots of really hard stuff. And you can't stop thinking, if only I could again just work with Ben.
She's probably quite envious of us, eh?
I imagine she listens to this and maybe listening to Ben, having just a good old fashioned bantery time with his good friends Annabelle and Toby is what tipped it for her.
100%. And because she's listening in all the time, I think she heard me predict that she would lose her electorate seat at the election. And I think that really informed her decision. I think it's really facts. I think it's really cool when people leave Parliament of their own accord, and when they leave, I guess, at the height of their influence. So I think that's a really powerful move for her, and I think it'll stand her in good stead in the future. On the flip side, her legacy is horrible. It's one of destroying pay equity, and as we head into this massive oil crisis, I think about all of the working mums at the bottom of the heap who will be doing it real tough, and who that would have made a material difference to their lives. So it'll be interesting to watch and see what she does next.
Being interested in your thoughts on this. First of all, most importantly, do you think it was because she misses working with you that she's decided to return to the private sector, I beg your pardon? Also, two other bits around the edges of it which are interesting. One is that there will be some members of the National Party who might be a bit pissed off because they would have been expecting for her to retain Tamaki, which now is a hell of a lot harder with an unknown, presumably unknown. I don't think, I don't know who they're going to put in there. I mean, maybe Andrew Foster will come to Tamaki and win that after his term, but that will could well mean that National will retain electorate seat, and that means one fewer list seat, which is bad news if you're Paul Goldsmith, Nicola Willis, possibly Chris Bishop, Jerry Brownlee, etc. And then the other point is that Max Harris, who is a well-known activist, lawyer, writer, had just been appointed by Labour to compete in Tamaki, presumably in order to prosecute quite deliberately issues around pay equity, labour relations, and now she's sort of disappeared, and it leaves a weird scenario.
Well, that's right. Max the Hitman Harris, one confirmed kill already in the campaign. 4 days on the job and the incumbent's gone. That's the sort of that's the another acute political assassination by the author of what was it called? The Politics of Love.
He wrote the book about New Zealand, the broader one. What was that called? And then he did a bit of Texas love stuff, which you've always been very mean about.
Yes. Yep. I've been very mean about a lot of Max's ideas over the years. And this is interesting, though, because, so I mean, look, to deal with the Brooke thing first, look, she's very young. She's been in politics all her life. Her first job was at Exceltium. She was in one of Matthew Hoodin's, I think, foreign affairs classes or something, and asked for an internship, and, he was impressed by her moxie, so she started working with us, and then she went to Parliament as a staffer, apparently did great things on the end-of-life choice bill, and then moved into deputy leader and whip, and then very, very young minister of very significant portfolios. She's overseen, I would say, probably the most significant Employment Relations Act reforms since the Employment Relations Act itself in 2003. She's doing probably less significant than expected workplace safety legislation overhaul. It seems to have finally sorted the Holidays Act, a workable replacement for that, which totally confounded previous ministers. Variable sort of legacy, but, will be a loss for ACT electorally. She did very well to win that Tamaki seat off Simon O'Connor. ACT, I think, will certainly, it becomes much harder for them to keep it. It's not really a kind of pass me down seat as Epsom was sort of in 2008, 2013, 2011, 2014. David Seymour very, very much sort of solidified there. I don't think anyone could dig him out, even if they wanted to now. But for a while, Epsom was just sort of, it was assumed that you kind of give it to whichever ACT person is in that seat. That's not the case with Tamaki. I think you're right. There'll be a number of national MPs, particularly list MPs, who will be kicking themselves that they didn't go for that Tamaki seat. Mahesh Muralidhar, very personable guy, great story, very successful. Didn't really exceed expectations or overperform as Nationals candidate for Auckland Central in the last election, I don't think. And so, but still has very good chance of basically sleepwalking into winning that seat. He won't be sleepwalking, he'll be very energetic, but...
Successful business person, which will go down well in
very
Tamaki.
Successful, yep. And, good talker, but bit Luxon-esque in the sense that I think, he begins every sort of conversation by saying, my story is, or I've got a great story, or, that sort of, that kind of, online starter, online founder kind of narrative or vocabulary. But it'd probably be a pretty good MP. It'll be interesting to see who ACT puts up in their current caucus. I wouldn't think Andrew Hoggard was really the guy, or Mark Cameron. In terms of those urban the urban liberals are actually a bit thinner on the ground in ACT than you might expect. In terms
Come
of the
back,
caucus,
Jamie
Todd
White.
Stevenson.
It's your time.
It's maybe not Jamie White's time just yet. We may need to sort of liberalise people. the polygamy and the polygamy discourse might need to get a little more advanced before it's Jeremy White's time.
The arc of history bends slowly.
It's interesting. I don't think Max Harris has a shot in hell of winning, but it is very interesting that he's standing. There's been a lot of buzz around Max for years and years and years. If you talk about sort of stories, he won some sort of scholarship at Oxford University that's only awarded every 400 years to somebody with like a lightning bolt birthmark or something.
One of those genius grants. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the where they like literally put you in a tower to just think for like 5 years or something, because and he pretty much any sort of high profile social cause that you see in the media, whether it's to compliant dental care or whatever, Max Harris's name will be one of the spokespeople at the bottom of the press release. He's extremely active in those spaces. He's a very, very bright guy, very, very highly regarded on the left. And so I think, I think having him as a candidate would be seen as quite a coup. It would be interesting to see where they put him on the list, whether, Labour definitely has a bit of a talent shortage right now. If they're poised on the precipice of becoming government again, they only need a few more things to go their way, and petrol at $4 would certainly be one of those things. And if they were to go into government and, try and form a cabinet right now, it would be pretty slim pickings in a lot of respects. And, somebody like Max would certainly be an attractive, proposition in that way. Like I said before, I made fun of a lot of Max's ideas and the stuff in the past. I don't think he's a great strategist or tactician in politics, but he's extremely bright and capable guy who would make a very good minister. And so you can see him being pretty high up on the list, Tamaki notwithstanding.
And with that, the Max Harris book, by the way, is the New Zealand Project. That's enough of us. We'll be back soon. Thanks, Annabelle. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Te Aihe. Thank you, listeners. And most importantly, happy birthday.